Hi, today I want to introduce you to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was born in Rocca Secca, near present-day Lazio, in northern Italy. He was educated mostly at the University of Paris and the University of Cologne, where he worked with and studied under Albert the Great. Albert the Great was one of the best philosophers of the age, so he had an outstanding education. He decided to join the Dominican order, and his family actually imprisoned him for about a year in his home castle to stop him from joining the order. Finally, he managed to escape with the help of a friend, and ended up having a tremendous career as a priest, as a philosopher, a theologian who became known as one of the doctors of the church. In fact, his philosophy is sometimes called the perennial philosophy, the philosophy that's really reflected in our common sense conceptions of a great many things. In fact, in some ways, if you don't know what Aquinas has to say about a topic, you can predict it by just thinking about a highly refined version of common sense. Or to look at it another way, a highly refined version of Aristotle. Now let me start by talking a little bit about the time of Aquinas' work. He was writing in the middle of the 13th century, a time that we think of as the High Middle Ages. It was something that was facilitated by the fact that everyone in Western Europe who was educated and who was participating in philosophical and theological debates knew Latin. Notice he went from his native Italy up to Paris, then to Cologne, then back to Italy in a variety of places, in Orvieto, in Naples, in Rome. He became the papal theologian in Rome for a time. And how was he able to move around that easily? People did that all the time in medieval universities, partly because all of the instruction in all of the universities was in Latin. So if you knew Latin, that was a universal language, a universal key to taking part in the intellectual discussions and debates in any of those universities. That was a tremendous advantage. The change that would happen about 100 to 200 years later, where the vernacular languages, French, Italian, German, Spanish, and so on, became the main vehicles of literature, was a great shot in the arm to literature, but it was actually harmful to philosophy. It broke apart that academic culture. Of course, other things broke apart that academic culture. About 100 years after Aquinas, the Black Plague ravaged Europe, and it especially hit hard in university towns, devastating the population that actually knew Latin. In any case, there was something else going on at the time that had a tremendous impact on Aquinas' career and on his philosophy. That was the revival of Aristotle. Ever since the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, very few people in Western Europe had access to many of the works of Aristotle. In fact, no one had access to the metaphysics, the Nicomachean Ethics, the physics, some of the key works of Aristotle. At best, they had access to a few logical and grammatical treatises. But in the 13th century, all of that began to change. There was a race to translate these Greek texts from the original Greek or from Arabic translations into Latin so that they would be available. And by the time of Aquinas, they were widely available. In fact, when he was in Paris, that's mostly what he studied in philosophy and theology, Aristotelian approaches. Some of them directly from Aristotle, some of them filtered through Arabic commentators like Averroes. In any case, that was to have a big impact on his career. He was asked to come to Paris to help fight against the Averroist interpretations of Aristotle. And near the end of his life, he was asked by the Pope to represent the papal authority at the Second Council of Lyon. It was an attempt to try to unify Eastern and Western churches. He never made it to the council. He was riding a donkey on the Appian Way when he hit his head on a tree branch and died from complications of that. He was only 48 years old. Nevertheless, he managed to revolutionize philosophy, revolutionize theology, and remains perhaps the greatest philosopher and theologian of the Middle Ages. Now, there's something very important intellectually about the rediscovery of Aristotle. Ever since Neoplatonism and the thought of Augustine, the dominant tendency in Christian philosophy was one of Platonism. The assumption was that there were forms. And ever since the work of some of the early church fathers, and especially of Augustine, There was a sense that the forms were ideas in the mind of God. All of that gave the forms an independent existence, an existence apart from their existence in particular things. And so you would talk about goodness, for example, not just goodness in a particular person, or goodness in a certain effective tool, or goodness in the case of God. But Aristotle had a different idea. The forms were real enough. He talks about forms all the time, sensible forms, intellectual forms, and so on, but they are always in objects. His position is known as a moderate realism. The forms are real, they are mind independent, but they are in things. They don't have independent existence. And that's something that has a tremendous influence on Aquinas. There's one more thing about Aquinas that I want to tell you by way of introduction. His style is startling and to many people off-putting. It's part of a method that became known as the Scholastic Method and defined scholastic philosophy and the movement of scholasticism in medieval universities. It's a method that really is independent of any particular philosophical view. The idea is that you introduce a question, and then you examine arguments on both sides of that question. The way Aquinas does it is to set up a question and then give you a variety of arguments against the position he's ultimately going to adopt. So he lays them out, he calls them objections, objection 1, objection 2, objection 3. And then he usually quotes scripture or a famous theologian he respects, like Hilary of Poitiers, for example, and that goes in the other direction. Then he says, I say, and he gives you his own view, together with arguments in favor of that view. Then he responds to the objections. That is to say, he goes back to the opposing arguments and shows you his reply, why he doesn't think that argument has much force against the position he's articulated. Now, sometimes, with respect to the question at issue, his answer is yes or no, and he presents arguments on that side. But sometimes, in fact frequently, it's really drawing a distinction that is the key to his answer. He says, well, in one sense, yes, another sense, no. Those of you familiar with Aristotle will recognize that as a very traditional and common Aristotelian strategy. You look at a controversy over a question and you say, well, in a certain sense, both sides are right. It's not that the truth is halfway between them. It's that there is a kind of ambiguity, something that you have to pull apart. You draw a distinction to say, well, look, you guys are right in this sense. The other side is right in this sense. And so we'll see that strategy in looking at Aquinas again and again. He will say, yes, in a sense, this is right. In another sense, this is wrong. And he will use that to try to diffuse the arguments on the side he's mostly opposing. But of course, it really suggests something important about both sides. The key to the method is to really identify the key questions. And here I think we have something to learn from medieval philosophy. The scholastic method relies on people understanding the arguments on both sides of questions. So, some of the greatest works, in fact, by his time, the standard work that everybody was educated with, and one typically established one's mastery by writing a commentary on, was Peter Lombard's Sentences. The Sentences did not take a position on any of these crucial theological and metaphysical questions. Instead, what he did is introduce a question and give you the main arguments on both sides. Those of you familiar with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason will recognize this strategy from the antinomies that appear in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant isn't drawing those things out of nowhere. That was the way that one studied things, not only in the medieval period, but that survived through the Renaissance and into the early modern period itself. You would study a work like the Sentences. You would examine the basic questions of philosophy and theology. You would look at the arguments on both sides. And then your task to show mastery is not only to show you understand the arguments on both sides, but to develop a position, to say, here's what I think is right. It might involve taking that side, taking this side, but it might also involve drawing a distinction and saying that in a certain sense, both sides are right. The key is to establish the sense in which this side is right and the sense in which that side is right. In future videos, we're going to look at the details of Aquinas' positions, and we're going to start with his 5 ways, the 5 ways that he thinks it's possible to prove the existence of God.